Hi. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience of teaching in Pakistan and point out some of the differences that I feel become quite palpable when you're teaching in the global south or in this particular case in Pakistan. Um, One thing that I would say is very different is that teachers or people engaged in pedagogy broadly have to improvise a lot. There has to be a lot of emphasis on novelty. And for that, let me just give an example first from my teaching experience at universities, and then my pedagogical experience of teaching and learning as an activist. In universities, there are two basic ways in which I think the engagement with academic stuff is different from what I have experienced in the West. One is, of course, the gap between the textbooks that students are reading or that we're supposed to teach them and the actual lived reality of students. By that I mean, at one level, you have conceptual categories that have been developed in the West. So, for example, if you're teaching Marxism, you're teaching Max Weber or Foucault, very important thinkers. But of course, they're writing in a specific context, both spatial and temporal context. So, you situate them in European debates in the 19th century or in the 20th century, and when those ideas travel to um, the non-European world, when we have to teach them in our classrooms, there's a gap. There's a gap in the sense that students are not able to immediately relate to the kinds of questions that these authors are responding to, which leads to this bigger problem that theory cannot pretend to be universal. It cannot simply assume that the world and its history and all the singularities around the world, they don't matter, and someone writing in 19th century Europe would necessarily translate as it is in other parts of the world. So let's say when I was teaching political science, or I was teaching works on historical methodology or sociology, the kinds of methods or the kinds of questions that were being posed by European authors who are part of our canon now as well in Pakistan, they were so different from the experiences of people here. Uh, so one example, of course, is something that people have spoken about a lot, is that when teaching something like someone like Marx, who's talking about capitalism in Europe, the kind of capitalism that we see in Pakistan, with remnants of feudalism, with militarization of a different kind, with the incompleteness of the process of commodification and commodity production, you already kind of see that there's a gap. And this gap then has to be mediated by uh, novelty, by giving new examples that are locally rooted, and by making students relate that theory to what's happening in their lives, not only by saying how it matches that reality, but how that theory might be inadequate. And that is one part of teaching here that I find particularly productive and exciting, because in that sense, all of a sudden, you're not simply receiving theory from Europe or from the Western canon. You're, of course, reading it, you are receiving it as well, but you're then actively rethinking theory, because you have to then make that theory speak to concerns that young people have in Pakistan in this particular moment. And this kind of translation, this kind of explanation or interpretive labor that happens when an idea travels across space, I find that to be very productive, because I do believe it's important not to reject the theoretical premises of scholars, whether in the West or the East. I think scholars anywhere should be from anywhere should be read. But then the point is not to passively receive them, but to actually universalize their ideas by creating ruptures within their ideas, rather than showing almost like this absolute fidelity to the text, or this absolute mimicry of these masters. And in that sense, I feel a lot of young people that I've worked with and I've taught, they've started working on how, when they when they when they engage with theory actively and try to rethink the coordinates of the theory based on their own experience, they can actually contribute towards theory. So that when those ideas return to Europe, Europeans can also see the blind spots within their theoretical edifice. And I think this kind of circulation of ideas becomes more interesting through the ruptures that happen, through the novelty and improvisation that happens across space, rather than simply, this kind of global division where Europeans are doing the thinking and then we're doing the implementation, or we're trying to catch up. And that's something I found to be very productive. Uh, the other way in which it's very different is, of course, the question of censorship. We are under a government or a state that is extremely paranoid. I mean, just recently, a conference was cancelled at this premier university of Pakistan called LUMS. This conference was supposed to be on Bangladesh, which was part of Pakistan, and it separated in 1971. And there was so much paranoia that eventually the military generals called the university and said there will be dire consequences if you go ahead with it. So there's this excessive fear of the power of the word, the power of an idea, and there's always an attempt to suppress this idea or this word through brute force. So you're looking at two logics: the logics of idea being met with the power of violence, of physical violence. And that's something that's very common because the state increasingly is in this situation where it feels that anything that exceeds its normative language, anything that exceeds what it deems legitimate, it immediately sees it as some kind of a foreign entity, foreign conspiracy, as some kind of an excess within the system, as disruptive, and then it cannot name it, so it calls it foreign agent, or calls it, RAW, which is the Indian secret agency, or Mossad, or CIA, or anything that is no longer part of the national political community. And I think it reveals how it's the dealing with new ideas becomes a linguistic crisis for the state. It's a properly linguistic crisis because it does not have the interpretive power, or the words to describe what's happening, and that means a lot of difficulties on the ground. I mean, we've had blasphemy cases against professors, which is a very serious crime, quote unquote, in Pakistan. We have a professor who was a Fulbright scholar. His name was Junaid Hafiz. He's in prison for the last 8 years or so on blasphemy charges. A lot of professors have been fired. I'm currently unemployed. I've been fired from 3 places, and never through a disciplinary action, always arbitrary. And part of it has been the reason has been, of course, that people have just come in to university administrators and have threatened that if this person continues to teach, there will be consequences. And I mean, I'm at the moment also facing a sedition charge, which carries a life sentence. So, there is this whole paranoia that if you kind of exceed the language deemed appropriate by the state, and we're dealing with very mediocre people, then there would be consequences. One other example that I have is of a military man who warned me before firing me, and he said, what we don't want you to do is discuss politics in your classrooms. And I said, that's fine, but the only problem is that I teach political science. And it's quite difficult to imagine teaching political science without discussing politics. So those are the kinds of like very irrational demands, excessive demands being made on professors. Most people, of course, try to conform, but we don't really even know what the red line is, because even if you don't cross the red line, sometimes the red line crosses you. Anyway, so that's what I think these are the two elements which are different in terms of teaching. One is conceptually just the fact that we're dealing with a European canon and has to be rethought in a different condition. And second, that there is this specter of censorship whenever you're speaking and talking, and it has serious consequences. The other thing I wanted to discuss was my teaching experience with students and workers outside of classrooms as an activist. And this has been a very, very productive engagement because a lot of students feel alienated, and that's partly because the universities are increasingly militarized. As I said, there's a lot of censorship, and students have no representation. Student unions, student governments were banned in Pakistan in 1984. So, it's very difficult to really give students a platform. And if few students are sitting together, you have some university guard will come and make them leave. I mean, recently, a couple of students were expelled from a university because a woman proposed to a boy. They were expelled, both of them. Um, so this is the kind of like very, very patriarchal, very childish almost ways of trying to control adults. And when we started doing reading groups with these students, I saw them like all of a sudden take so much interest in academic texts like they never did. I mean, I remember we started with Hegel, and then we did Fanon, and we did Marx, and we did John Stuart Mill, all kinds of different authors, and students would come up with the people they wanted to read. And I was there, I was present, but we would often just have discussions with students, like in a circle, rather than like me giving lectures. And by the end of it, students were no longer talking about something alien. They were trying to see how someone like John Stuart Mill can make sense to their lived experience. The fact that they don't have liberty, for example, or how is Marx's concept of alienation so true for young people today in Pakistan? Or how is Foucault's idea of a disciplinary society something that they experience every day? Also, these texts became meaningful. They became alive in some way. It allowed people to not only engage with these texts as something written somewhere, but as provocations or as provocations to rethink their own lives, to maybe intervene in the world in a different way. And they also became a way to create a new sense of community. And I think that could be a really powerful text, one that can not only make people think, but also allow people to come together. And that's something that one can do with text if one presents them in a different way. I still remember there was a discussion between Deleuze and Foucault um on the relationship between the left and the work that they were doing. And by the end of it, people didn't want to stop. Even after the reading group, they went for dinner. They were continuing the discussion. They were looking at national politics, global politics through that lens. And all of a sudden, those texts became they became almost weapons for these young people to reorient themselves, to feel less alienated, to feel like they belong. And I think that played a massive role in reigniting the student movement in Pakistan. I mean, these kinds of reading groups, they were happening all over the world. I did not, all over Pakistan, I did not I wasn't the only one who was doing them. A lot of other sympathetic teachers were doing it. And then a lot of young people started these reading groups on their own as well. And eventually, it's these students from across Pakistan who were reading texts that then started meeting students across Pakistan and started doing reading groups across Pakistan, which then led to the Student Action Committee in 2019, which organized the largest student demonstrations in Pakistan since the 1970s. This was in November 2019. And this was a remarkable shift in the consciousness of young people. They were men, women, people from all ethnic backgrounds. And that's something also important to highlight. I mean, the kind of rampant harassment cases on campuses became more, voices against them became more prominent during this period, and also the racism faced by those from ethnic minorities. And all of a sudden, it seemed to me while I was engaged in this process that these students are not just encountering the texts, they're not just encountering others, but they're also encountering parts of themselves that have been repressed. It's like, impossible encounters that they were finally having, and so there were all these other possibilities within them that they did not even know. So many of them became student leaders, so many of them became writers, and now many of our students are working in human rights groups, are working in journalism, doing critical journalistic work. Some of them are going abroad to pursue their PhDs, but informed by this sense of community, by this sense of encountering difference. Okay, in conclusion, I'll just say that, I think uh, if I were to say there are two ways in which teaching here in under these militarized conditions is different is one, we cannot take the text for granted, not only because of course every text needs to be rethought and read critically, but also because we have to provincialize European writers or Western writers. We have to remind ourselves that the context is so different, that the only way we can participate in global academia is by constantly telling uh, authors in the global north that there are serious blind spots in their work. And this is not to just criticize them. This is like actually can be a collaborative work in trying to improve theory, in trying to create new ways of looking at the world, in trying to actually start building a form of universalism that recognizes historical difference. And the second way in which I think it's very different is that when you're dealing with ideas here, they're real life threats. There is the possibility of young people being abducted, sedition charges, professors being kicked out of their jobs. All of these things are very much a palpable reality. And in that sense, when one is engaging with ideas, one is engaging with something that is alive, that is active, and that has consequences. So one almost has to make some very serious ethical choices, some very serious personal choices, some very serious career choices when one is engaging with critical thought in a place like Pakistan. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.